Hi, welcome to class. I'm Elaine Engelhardt, and the class is Ethics and Values. Now we're on our section on environmental ethics, and we're glad to have Dr. David Keller join us today as our special guest in discussing a piece by Paul Hawken. So thanks for being with us, David.
It's a pleasure.
Oh, I'm so glad you're here. And over here, we have Kisper and Luke, and I'd like to welcome both Kisper and Luke. Thank you. And over here, we have Cassie and Rhonda. Cassie, Rhonda, thank you. It's nice to have you here. And David, as we move on into environmental ethics, this is a specialty of yours, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your academic background and how you found yourself studying and becoming a specialist in environmental theory.
Well, I grew up here in Utah, but I attended college at Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and studied philosophy and English literature, and moved on to Boston College to do a master's degree in philosophy. And it was at Boston College that I found that in environmental ethics I could meld my academic interest in philosophy with my background and love of the natural beauty of the Rocky Mountains in Utah.
Great.
And then I went on to the University of Georgia and did a doctorate in philosophy, focusing on environmental ethiks.
And tell us a little bit about your first book that's on the philosophy of ecology.
My first book, titled The Philosophy of Ecology, explored the philosophical implications of the science of ecology. There are many interesting implications or ramifications of the science of ecology for the philosopher, such as can biological science provide a foundation or at least inform ethics, which is directly relevant to the topic today.
Absolutely. Quite often, environmental ethics is seen as a controversial area. People will say, oh, those darn environmentalists or those tree huggers, but, or other things. And why is environmental ethics an important area of study, particularly for our students who are in the Ethics and Values course?
I think there's a widespread equivocation and misunderstanding regarding environmental ethics. Many people think environmental ethics is the same as environmentalism, which is, of course, a political platform. Environmental ethics is not a political platform. It's the academic study of the relationship of human beings to natural ecological systems. And that study could lead to environmentalism or not. And the two simply are not the same.
Okay, and we have other terms. The term conservation, how might that be seen as a term that's different from environmentalism?
Well, conservation, again, is a political platform, a form of environmentalism which would aim at preserving natural resources for future generations, to conserve natural resources. And there you're making a political, ethical statement. It's the right thing for present generations to conserve resources for future generations. But again, there you're not making simply a descriptive statement about the biosphere. You're making a political statement. Correct public policy is the conservation of resources for future generations. And in this day and age, especially in light of global warming and global climate change, that is a very controversial topic, and people have decidedly different opinions about that.
Okay, thanks. Rhonda, do you find it a controversial or an uncomfortable topic, environmental ethics?
You know, it really depends on what group you're talking to, but I think generally speaking, yeah, it's controversial.
Okay, and Luke, where's the clash? Where's the rub? What makes it controversial, if you believe it is?
I think the controversy lies in people just have very different ideas about, there's, especially in America, we're very individualistic, and we believe very much in individual rights and liberties, and that sort of emphasis on individual rights often leads people to say, well, this property is my property, I should be able to do whatever I want with it, and if I can if I should be able to allow my cattle to graze here, whatever the case may be. And that sort of individual rights focus can sometimes come in conflict with the idea of a public good in preserving the ecosphere.
Okay, very good. Why can't I ride my ATVs anywhere I want? Or, Cassie, as we'll see in this episode today, what happens when business interests conflict with environmental interests? And why is that so very, very heated when business interests are compounded by environmental theory?
Well, because most businesses aren't necessarily concerned with how they're affecting the environment, but rather the profit, how their business is doing.
Okay, and some of them are very concerned, but as we see in this article, their concern actually needs to go kind of outside the box.
Right.
That people have been thinking inside the box and what are some things that I can do. But Hawken is going to say, no, we've got some deeper issues. Dr. Keller, anything you'd like to add to that about the problem between business and the environment and how the two of them clash? We've just barely finished our section on business ethics.
I think that Luke alluded to it very well, and that is that in our social, political, economic system, we value free markets, and oftentimes environmentalism or consideration of environmental factors in the cost-benefit analysis of doing business is seen as an impediment to doing business. And as we will see on the episode today, there is a growing awareness that the cost of doing business is not simply related to the cost of materials and the cost of labor and the cost of say, running a factory, but what economists call externalities, or costs that are indirectly related to the cost of producing a good, which might be pollution or environmental degradation or other factors like that.
Okay, thanks. Any questions or comments? Well, Cassie, do you want to tell us a little bit about our author on this, Paul Hawken?
Sure. Paul Hawken is an environmentalist, an entrepreneur, a journalist, and an author. So he covers a lot of bases. He started at age 20 and decided to dedicate his life to sustainability and changing the relationship between business and the environment. His practice has included starting and running ecological businesses, and there are several of them, writing and teaching about the impact of commerce on living systems, and consulting with governments and corporations on economic development, industrial ecology, and environmental policy.
Okay, thank you. And he's really had some cutting ground here. David, I noticed that you have a book here that you put out, and many of our faculty have submissions in it called Sustainability. Do you want to tell us a little bit about this topic of sustainability and why it was important to have a faculty conference on the topic? And you can hold it up.
This is, I'm holding a proceedings of the annual conference by the faculty several years ago, and the topic was sustainability. And the reason I chose sustainability for the annual conference by the faculty is that it's intrinsically interdisciplinary. It interweaves, as we will see today, ethics, ecology, economics, amongst other things. So I find the topic of sustainability interdisciplinary and ethically multifaceted and challenging and a lot of fun.
Absolutely, a lot of fun. So let the fun begin. And Lloyd, could I have, Luke, could I have you read our first graphic for us, please?
Yes. There is a growing vanguard of companies attempting to redefine their social and ethical responsibilities. These companies no longer accept the maxim that the business of business is business.
And continue.
Their premise is simple. Corporations, because they are the dominant institution on the planet, must squarely face the social and environmental problems that afflict humankind.
And I'm even going to have you read the next one as well, Luke, because this actually gets us right into the thesis.
If every company on the planet were to adopt the environmental and social practices of the best companies, the world would still be moving toward environmental degradation and collapse.
Okay, thanks. Well, and actually it is continued, so go ahead and read the next one.
If a tiny fraction of the world's most intelligent companies cannot model a sustainable world, then that tells us that being socially responsible is only one part of an overall solution, and that what we have is not a management problem, but a design problem.
Okay, thanks, Luke. And as this reading started out, we've got Ben & Jerry's. And Ben & Jerry's is trying to do everything they can to fit right in with a very environmentally friendly and employee-friendly program. You want to tell us a little bit about what Ben & Jerry's are doing, Cassie?
Well, yeah, they're basically just being a very responsible company, and the way that their treatment of their cows that are used in production, their recycling, and the products that they use for packaging, and also the treatment of their employees and the benefits that they give them, and that they're just being very responsible, and which isn't as common for larger companies. But
they have certainly been heralded, haven't they, for all the good work that they've done in trying to really show a very environmentally friendly problem. But yet, Hawken here says they're not doing enough. David, do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I think that he evokes the example of Ben & Jerry's because, as Cassie has pointed out, Ben & Jerry's has developed a reputation of being a socially responsible corporation, a corporation that simply doesn't live by the motto, the business of business is business, but rather the business of business is to improve the human condition. And I think that Hawken evokes Ben & Jerry's as an example of a new type of corporation whose concerns are not simply the maximization of profits, as Cassie alluded to, but to make profits along with doing good for society, the human condition, and the biosphere. Okay, so we end up with some real challenges, don't we? In saying, can you go this far? Can you really switch your paradigm and run business in the way that Paul Hawken says, and that we have to look at a lot of different costs? So any thoughts on this? Luke?
I just think this is interesting. I worked as a grant writer, and these socially responsible companies, their foundations that give out grants are some of the largest foundations out there, and they do give away tremendous amounts of money. I would always run into Ben & Jerry's Foundation or some of the other companies out there that take it upon themselves to be socially responsible, because a profit-making venture like a corporation, if it does focus even 1% of its revenue towards sort of promoting socially responsible activities, can very quickly become one of the largest foundations out there giving charitable grants.
Okay, giving charitable grants, really caring about the community. And he's going to say there's nothing wrong with that. Yes, Cassie, but there has to be more. Go ahead.
Going along with that, yeah, basically, I mean, we've already kind of talked about this, but he said that as much as they're doing, even if everyone did it, the problem is not going to be solved by individual businesses doing this, but there's just basic design problems, like he said. And he goes into talking about how we can change that, and it's really interesting.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and look at some of these basic design problems that can be changed, and pull up the next graphic on that with the socially responsible corporate contradiction. And could you read this for us, please, Rhonda?
Sure. That a company can make the world better, can grow, and can increase profits by meeting social and environmental needs. It is a have your cake and eat it fantasy that cannot come true if the primary cause of environmental is overconsumption.
So we're moving into this notion of overconsumption, that we are huge consumers. What can you tell us about overconsumption, Luke?
We've touched on it several times in different episodes, but Americans are colossal consumers. One analogy is to think in terms of how many square acres is required to sustain one American, and I think we're at 17 acres, coming from different things, from the ocean to get fish, fields and so forth, depending on what we're eating. But the average American about 17 acres, and I can't remember who it is who makes this analogy, but somebody argues, just think about if you had a rope tied around your waist and a big balloon over your head with 17 acres worth of land, you know, something bigger than our campus here, that's what you consume every single year. That's what it takes to sustain you.
It's an amazing thought, isn't it, Rhonda?
You know, I was just thinking about our trees. You know, you mentioned tree huggers, but you know, and it's not just Americans, and I'm reminded of that at Christmas time or at birthdays. Have you ever tried to get into a child's toy? You know, the packaging that's involved in it. You almost have to have a strong arm, you know, to rip the thing apart. There's so much packaging, so much waste that goes with it.
Just part of the overconsumerism, and you also see that they've got 5 toys, end up liking the package better than the toy.
Exactly.
Don't play with any of those. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about this overconsumerism, David?
Well, what Hawken is calling for clearly is a paradigm shift in the way that we think about business, and what he's getting at is this. Business traditionally has encouraged consumption. As Luke eloquently said, Americans are conspicuous or colossal consumers vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Our consumption is good for business because the more we consume, the more we buy, and the more that we throw away, the more we replace what we've thrown away with more products, and this is good for business, but it's not sustainable. Luke alluded to an image by Bill McKibben who says that if the size of our stomach conformed to the biosphere, what the amount of energy it really takes us to keep us alive that is biospherically sustainable in the long run, the size of an American stomach would be the size of a Macy's balloon. This huge, gargantuan thing extending out of our body way up into the stratosphere. Hawken's point is that that paradigm is not sustainable in the context of the biosphere in the long run, which requires a paradigm shift in the way that we think about our economic activity.
Okay, and we can see then that business then is making a lot of money. They'd like to continue making a lot of money, and it's made on our consumption. And he's going to say, none of us really stop and think about it as consumers. And a lot of folks, even Ben & Jerry's, don't understand everything that it takes for them to do business and having people do mass consumption of their product. So let's go ahead and have Kisper read our next graphic then.
In order to approximate a sustainable society, we need to describe a system of commerce and production in which each and every act is inherently sustainable and restorative.
And the next one?
Because of the way our system of commerce is designed, business will not be able to fulfill their social contract with the environment or society until the system in which they operate undergoes a fundamental change, a change that brings commerce and governance into alignment with the natural world from which we receive our life.
Okay, thank you. So we receive our life then from this natural world, and he's saying we're completely out of alignment with this natural world, especially the United States, that there is so much that we are demanding that just isn't necessary, and there is so much that's being produced by business and industry that isn't necessary as well. Comments from the students on this? Okay, well, David, what do you think about this as he's moving his thesis along for us?
Well, here we see him moving away from the traditional idea articulated by Milton Friedman in 1970 in his famous New York Times Magazine article, The Social Responsibility of Business. And in that article, Friedman and many traditional economists have argued that the business of business is business which is to maximize profits, and the only responsibility of business is to its stockholders, people who own stock in the company. And to be socially responsible is actually costly to stockholders. It may reduce profits. Here, Hawken is repudiating that traditional model of business, the stockholder model, and he's calling for really an environmental or ecological stakeholder model in which corporations should be sensitive to other stakeholders in the environmental, the ecological community, which may be outside of the concerns of the company. But pollution and noise and the consumption of natural resources impacts us all because we all share the biosphere, and Hawken is trying to bring our attention to this interconnectedness of all of us, which the traditional business model tends to overlook.
Okay, very good. And so we've discussed before some of the costs of people doing business, the costs of cigarettes and what they do as far as elevating the costs of medical insurance and medical care. We've discussed costs of pollution, as you mentioned, and what these pollutants have done to the air, that they come back and maybe can cause emphysema and other things. But have these products really, maybe outside of the example of smoking, ever been asked to really pay for some of these results that happen? And these are the big questions he's going to move into then, aren't they?
Absolutely. That's the keystone of the piece.
Okay. Anyone want to comment on any of this then? Okay, well, Rhonda, let's have you read our next graphic for us then.
What is needed is a conscious plan to create a sustainable future, including a set of design strategies for people to follow.
Okay, and his first plan, let's pull that up.
Corporations are chartered by and exist at the behest of citizens. Incorporation is not a right, but a privilege granted by the state that includes certain considerations such as limited liability. Corporations are supposed to be under our ultimate authority, not the other way around. The charter of a corporation is a revocable dispensation that was supposed to ensure accountability of the corporation to society as a whole.
Okay, thank you. So tell us a little bit about this, Luke. What's he saying as his number one declaration of the plan for a sustainable future?
Well, he's saying that, and we've discussed this a little bit, but the idea of corporations is that it's an artificial entity that is allowed to exist by the state, and it can be revoked if it violates its duty to be contributing to society. So he's saying we need to take that back because we simply don't do that anymore, and it's been at least 130 years since we did that on a regular basis, where we would revoke a corporate charter.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And so, in fact, the next graphic goes on to really underline this point as well. And Kisper, would you read that for us?
Yes. When any corporation abuses or violates the public trust, citizens should have the right to revoke its charter, causing the company to disband, sell off its enterprises to other companies, and effectively go out of business.
Okay, David, this is a very controversial notion, isn't it? So he's coming back and saying corporations are chartered by we the people, and if we the people see any abuses, particularly now he's going to say environmental abuses, we should be able to come back and put this gang out of business. And he said, maybe we'll re-employ the employees, but he really wants to punish the leaders of these companies. You want to tell us a little bit about this controversial notion of his?
It is very controversial because what he's, again, calling for is a paradigm shift in traditional laissez-faire economics. And this is what I love about the topic of sustainability. This gets us right into economic theory and economics. And reading this passage made me think of Adam Smith's famous passage in The Wealth of Nations about the butcher, the brewer, and the baker. And Adam Smith, in brief, says that if left alone, the butcher, the brewer, and the baker, in their egoistic motivation to maximize profits, will barter and trade and specialize in their own task, but everyone benefits from each other's products. Now, traditional economists have often singled out this passage as an example that Smith was really against social intervention in economic activity. But what Hawken is bringing our attention to is that the butcher, the brewer, and the baker, or any corporation, exists at the leisure, exists at the will of society, because the butcher, the brewer, and the baker, or any corporation, could not carry on economic activity without a social structure. And so what Hawken is saying, I believe, is that corporations do have a social, moral, and ecological responsibility to the community at large, and that they can't just myopically focus in on profit maximization. And that's why it is controversial.
Very good. Cassie?
And I was just thinking of what a huge shift this is, because I think in the average person, we think of, just because of past experience and the way that it has been, of corporations as these huge, indestructible entities that are just all powerful, and we don't really think that we have any kind of control or say in that, but it's kind of cool what he's saying.
Okay, and Rhonda?
And I think too that some corporations that are so huge that people are afraid to stand up to them or to put their feet to the fire, so to speak, to make them make a better design, because of, if that happens, well, what might happen to our jobs? What might happen if we don't have these, so that we can't take care of our families or this? And so they hold it over people's heads, I think, so that they can continue to do what they do.
Great comments from both of you. And Luke, how about the notion that you have to work hard on this? You then have to say, I see something wrong here, you as a consumer, and now you're going to have to work hard to point it out. You're going to have to make arguments and send around petitions.
Yeah, that is an important point, which is to say that I think if we did do this, we wouldn't suddenly start shutting down corporations left and right, because you would have to make a convincing case and meet a burden of proof and so forth in order to do it. It would have to be fairly egregious. We do try corporate executives from time to time, but we do not necessarily, we don't eliminate corporations, which is different.
It has to be pretty criminal, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Kisper.
I have a question. Hawken seems to be putting a lot of pressure, obviously, on the businesses and their responsibilities. Is he putting the pressure on the citizens as well? He says that citizens should have the right to revoke the charter of the company, but is he putting a responsibility on those citizens, or just saying they have that right?
I think there is responsibility on the citizens, that the citizens can't just ignore what's going on in their own community, and they can't ignore the impacts that these different industries are making on the community. There are significant costs. So he's expecting that if the corporation isn't making changes, that the citizens will point out to the corporation, these are the things that are egregious to us, these are the things that are harming the community, these are our costs. David?
I think Kisper is making a very important point, and that is Hawken is saying that as responsible citizens, we need to vote with our pocketbook, or to put it another way, we need to be responsible consumers. So we can't just have a complacent attitude, well, there's this awful economic system, I'm a part of it, and I'll just let it sweep me away. And I know that there are problems with it, but I am just this one individual in the face of these big corporations, as Rhonda pointed out, and I don't have the power to do anything. He's saying we do have the power by the products we buy and the way that we consume.
Thank you. And that doesn't have to be too scary, but almost even discussing this article is a little scary. You start thinking, wow, I'm taking on some pretty powerful people, or Hawken is taking on some pretty powerful people with this argument, and we're bringing about a discussion on it, but a very important discussion. So let's go ahead and read the next point, which helps us just a little more with this very important vote concept. And would you read that for us, Cassie?
A just price to reflect cost. The economy is environmentally and commercially dysfunctional because the market does not provide consumers with proper information. The free market economies that we love so much are excellent at setting prices, but lousy when it comes to recognizing costs. Simply stated, the marketplace gives us the wrong information.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about where he's going here. How do you read between the lines on this, Cassie?
I think that there's a lot of cost involved that isn't taken into account. The cost on the environment, the cost on the land, or just, yeah, that's the first thing that comes to mind. But
okay, thanks. And Luke?
I think this is very interesting. It's interesting to me that he doesn't use the phrase, but he's talking about ex ante incentive-based regulation, where he's saying that you should include in the cost of the product, it's what we refer to as externalities now. Those externalities should be placed inside the cost. So with cigarettes, for example, you would have, this is not an environmental one, but as an example, you have a cigarette tax, which is meant to fund anti-smoking education and so forth. And that cigarette tax includes in the cigarette a certain amount of the cost that it is going to have to society, to people's health, and so on. And he's saying do the same thing with environmental costs.
Yes, in fact, he calls them green fees, doesn't he? And it's going to be one of our next points that comes up. Rhonda?
I think part of the problem is that corporations know that the majority of people in the United States just don't care. They don't want to be bothered with anything that has to do with the environment. The majority, I'm not saying all people, because there are wonderful people that do. You know, from the neighborhood that I live in to employing, some of the children to help me pick up all the trash that flies here and flies there, where people have no thought about just throwing the gum wrapper or, on the ground beside them. People have to be part of the solution. And so many times they're not.
Okay, thank you. David, some comments on this then?
Well, in this section, adjust price to reflect cost, I believe that Hawken is explicitly calling for what has been alluded to, and that is that externalities should be internalized into the cost of the product. Absolutely. And economists call an externality a secondary repercussion of an economic activity which affects the community at large. So converting a toxic waste dump into the park is going to have a positive externality for landowners around the area because their land values will go up. A negative externality would be something that reduces the value of a socially held resource like the air. And so air pollution is part of the cost of producing the product, but it is not reflected in the product itself. As a matter of fact, here in Utah Valley, we have an example of one of the most famous cases in epidemiology, and that is the case of Geneva Steel. In the mid-1980s, due to market forces, Geneva Steel closed down for 18 months. And epidemiologists kept track of the incidence of respiratory illnesses before it closed down, during its closure, and then after its reopening. And what these epidemiologists found was that before Geneva Steel closed down, the rate of respiratory illness was at a certain level, and after an 18-month period, it dipped down, and for over a year, it remained at a lower level, and then when Geneva Steel opened back up, it rose again to its previous level. Now, from a sustainable perspective, part of the cost of buying steel should be the cost of treating respiratory illness, because the activity of producing steel causes respiratory illness. But steel has an artificially low price because that cost was never reflected in the market value. And so when Hawken says the marketplace is good at setting prices, but lousy at recognizing costs. This is what he's talking about.
Excellent point. The Arden Pope study was amazing because he had been trying to prove there were respiratory problems different times of the years when we would have an inversion, but he didn't know he was going to become so lucky as to have it closed down for his research, lucky for his research, and then could show this. And in fact, right after this quote in your reading, he goes on to say, in order for a sustainable society to exist, every purchase must reflect or at least approximate its actual cost, not only the direct cost, but also the costs to the air, water, soil, the cost to future generations, the cost to worker health, the cost to waste, pollution, and toxicity. Simply stated, the marketplace gives us the wrong information. It tells us that flying across the country on a discount airline is cheap when it's not. And he's saying it tells us food is inexpensive when its method of production destroys aquifers and soil, the viability of ecosystems, and the workers' lives. And so he's going to say there are so many things, so many costs that we're not looking at here. And it is so rare to have a study like the one you mentioned, because sometimes this just becomes words. And sometimes a study even just becomes words where people say, well, interesting that that happened, but we all need our jobs. So.
It's like there's a general apathy.
There can be, or you know, just not wanting to admit that Hawkins is making a strong, important point.
Absolutely.
Yes, Luke.
I think also on this point, it's interesting to note that, you know, we do kind of the opposite of this right now, is we either don't take in costs, or when we do it after the fact. After somebody is polluted, that's when we're going to find them and so forth, when the damage is already done. And, you know, that's bad for an obvious reason, but it also encourages corporations to sort of gamble. Mm-hmm. If I can pollute and not get caught, then I've saved a lot of money. If I do get caught, I'll be in trouble, but you know, I have this option to gamble, and it encourages them to be not socially responsible by including the cost in the price. Then you remove that incentive to gamble.
And it's unfortunate because I think, as Hawken is trying to do here, he's trying to say there are some very responsible companies, mm-hmm. and there are some who wouldn't gamble with this, and there are others who would say, boy, just let me keep paying fines and I'll get away with this until they finally put me out of business. Mm-hmm. But I don't want to make the changes. Well, let's see then how he's going to go pull a little more anarchy on us and say, let's get rid of the entire tax structure. Let's impose some green fees. And Kisper, would you read this for us, please?
The present tax system sends the wrong messages to virtually everyone, encourages waste, discourages conservation, and rewards consumption. The entire tax system must be incrementally replaced over a 20-year period by green fees, taxes that are added onto existing products, energy, services, and materials, so that prices in the marketplace more closely approximate true costs.
Okay, thanks. So Luke, he's asking us for these green fees. What do you think about that?
I think it's a lot of what we've been talking about already. Those two kind of blend together. But I think another point to make about is, when you include the cost to the environment in the price of items, then people will automatically adjust their spending habits. And corporations will do the same thing. Rather than gambling, they'll just have more environmentally friendly business practices. And consumers will do the same thing with under green fees. They'll just buy the thing that's going to cost less, and because of the green fees, that will be the more environmentally friendly product.
It sounds logical. Yeah. It sounds logical and that it should be that way, but I think it'll be a real struggle. And let's go ahead and look at the next two graphics. And Rhonda, would you read them for us, please?
Negawatts are the opposite of energy. They represent the collaborative ability of a utility to harness efficiency instead of hydrocarbons. This conservation-based alternative saves ratepayers, shareholders, and the economy money. savings that are passed on along to everyone. All resource systems, including oil, gas, forests, and water, should be run by some form of utility. There should be markets in nega barrels, nega trees, and nega coal.
Okay, thank you. Cassie, did you raise your hand on that?
Oh, no, I thought that was kind of like, it sounds funny, but it's a really, it's a cool idea to show people how they're saving energy and to measure it in that way.
Okay, and he's saying that it needs to be some form of utility. David, do you want to tell us a little bit about this?
Well, what he's saying is that the corporations, it's to the benefit of corporations to encourage consumption because they will sell more products and make more money. So power utilities and timber companies and coal companies, it's to their advantage to encourage us to consume these products. What Hawken is saying, again, is that we need a fundamental rethinking of this entire system where corporations should be creatively thinking about how to encourage conservation and lower our consumption and encourage efficiency rather than consumption.
Okay,
do you mean that, so when you get your electric bill, for instance, if you're using less energy than maybe the year before, then you should have a reduction, not just a reduction because you're using less, but a reduction because you are using less?
He does not explicitly say that, but that certainly would be consistent with what he's saying. He's also saying that corporations should be rewarded by creatively thinking about how to promote efficiency rather than consumption, which is the opposite of our current model.
Absolutely.
Okay, and he moves on into his fifth point, and in his fifth point he's going to say we have these linear systems, but linear systems aren't the same as nature. Nature is going to work on a cyclical system. And could you read this for us, Cassie, please?
Our economy has many design flaws, but the most glaring one is that nature is cyclical and industrialism is linear. In nature, no linear systems exist, or they don't exist long because they exhaust themselves into extinction. Linear industrial systems take resources, transform them into products or services, discard waste, and sell to consumers, who discard more waste when they have consumed the product.
And continue.
Cyclical means production are designed to imitate natural systems in which waste equals food for other forms of life. Nothing is thrown away, and symbiosis replaces competition.
Okay, thank you. So he's giving an interesting notion here. Do you think it can work, Rhonda?
Absolutely. It's not something that, well, you know, in today's technological age, you would think that somebody could, without a whole lot of problem, devise situations where, for example, erosion would not be as it is if we had more of the right thing in place.
Okay.
He talks about a container for a toothpaste tube that is actually biodegradable and can be broken down easier and stuff like that.
Okay.
So, I mean, it can be done. It's going to be just a lot of changes, but.
Okay. And David, we see that many of us are resistant to change, or that change is difficult. Do you think that people really could do this, or would they say, oh, you're taking away my freedom and my rights?
I think that human beings, as all animals, tend to think in the short term. Mm-hmm. And what he's saying is this may be our inclination to think about tomorrow or a week away or a month away, but it's really to our advantage if we're truly rational animals to think in the long term. And I think that what he's saying is it's possible, we're rational, so we can assess the situation and our place in the biosphere and our current economic system and make it happen. But like all change of habits, it's going to come difficultly.
Okay. Absolutely difficultly, yes.
No, I was thinking of a couple of years ago in the Salt Lake Valley. It was a new development of homes, and several homeowners decided to plant their front yards according to the desert. And instead of planting, grass and nothing else, because grass takes so much water. And their particular homeowners association made them dig up that and plant grass because it looked better. You know, I thought.
Yeah. Well, people can be very resistant to change. The xeriscaping has been quite popular in Utah, and I know that the mayor of Salt Lake had taken on this as a move on his own property even. But I suppose that there are other homeowners associations who don't want the change. Any thoughts on that?
It's even worse than Rhonda says. It was, I served on the board of directors for the Utah Rivers Council that promotes the wise use of water in a desert ecosystem, and it was actually city and county statute that was violated, and that is,
That's right.
if you have a sidewalk in front of your house, you're responsible for that little strip between the sidewalk and the street. And people, ecologically aware, decided to plant with a more sustainable desert plants because grass is very water consumptive.
Right.
But they were violating public policy law. And so that's an example of simply where public policy lags behind ecological awareness. Probably the intent of that law was that people are responsible for this strip and they can't just let it become weeds and dirt, that they should manicure it and have a nice green lawn there. But paradoxically, xeriscaping did not allow for this.
And that was actually a more expensive way. You know, they were being responsible.
It's far more expensive to water a lawn in between the sidewalk
Absolutely.
and the road than have xeriscaping. So again, public policy was counterproductive in that instance.
And it still hasn't changed then?
I don't know.
It has changed.
It
Probably,
has, I would
yeah.
say.
That ordinance was actually changed, but there's another one that is still on the books, I think just in Salt Lake City, which may or not be changed. So.
Thank you. And I think what happens also, David, is that sometimes we get really excited about these movements and things that we can do, and then our excitement wanes, and we get involved in the next TV series, and we forget how important that some of these conservation and other efforts are. So let's just go ahead and look up our next graphic and have you comment on that for us. And would you read that, Rhonda?
Transform the making of things. Consumables. The first are consumables, products that are either eaten or, when they're placed on the ground, turn into dirt without any bioaccumulative effects. We should be designing more things so that they can be thrown away into the compost heap.
Okay, so speaking of change, can this happen, David?
Of course it can. Again, we need to change the way our habits and the way we consume things. And what he's saying here is that products should be designed for an end life, rather than being tossed into the junk heap and forgotten about. They should be designed with an eye to what's going to happen to them when their consumable life is over.
Okay, just like Cassie's example. You have a comment, Cassie?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that they said they're talking about recycling, and they said we don't really, recycling isn't really what we want to do. We want to be focused more on the end life, more on the cyclical way of things, because recycling, although it's trying to be more cyclical, it's still fairly linear.
Okay, thank you. And the next area that he moves to, Luke, is called durables. Will you read that for us?
The second category is durables, but in this case, they would not be sold, only licensed. Cars, TVs, VCRs, and refrigerators would always belong to the original manufacturer, so they would be made, used, and returned within a closed-loop system. If a company knows that its products will come back someday, and that it cannot throw anything away when they do, it creates a very different approach to design and materials.
Okay,
Wow.
great idea. Will it happen, Luke? Can it happen? I mean, it's a fun idea, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it can happen, and well, with all of these, we can say it would be difficult to do, but it requires a change in policy and a change in consumer habits.
Okay.
Didn't he say that they were already starting to do this in Germany or something?
He did.
And
He
that was-
said
this
that
was
there are
written
places in the
a
world
while
where it is
ago, yeah.
happening. Yeah. Yeah, very good. I would see a lot of resistance to this one, as well as the next one. But
Everyone wants
absolutely.
to own, have several DVD players, several, there's something that people have about ownership. And I think that would be a big blockade that you'd run into.
It's as much of
actually-
ownership as it is the companies who are
Yeah,
going, I don't
yeah,
want to
'cause
deal
see,
with that.
Actually,
Oh, yeah.
having to call the Maytag man and say, okay, I'm
Doesn't
done
work.
with it, come get it. It wore out. and maybe we would have some changes. David?
The changes are occurring, actually. We all know that cathode ray tubes in computer monitors and television screens are toxic, as well as our batteries and cell phones and all of the myriad other things that we have. And there are many landfills in the U.S. that will not accept what are essentially these toxic hazardous wastes.
Yeah.
And we end up shipping a lot of our durable products that have each reached their end life to China and other places that will accept them. What he is saying is that products should be designed to be dismantled and reused by the manufacturer at the end of their life, rather than shipped across the ocean to some country that is willing to accept them for fiscal reasons.
And I really like the point that he makes with this, because so often maybe your can opener breaks down in a year and you can't even find the part to fix it, or anyone who will, and instead you just throw it away and get another one. And here he's saying, I find that rather unethical, actually, that I can't even find a part to fix it. He's saying, no, they have to be dismantled, fixed, and sold again type of thing. Okay, thanks. Well, let's look at these next unsaleables. And Kisper, would you read that for us?
Last, there are unsaleables: toxins, radiation, heavy metals, and chemicals. There is no living system for which these are food, and thus they can never be thrown away. All toxic chemicals would have molecular markers identifying them as belonging to their originator, so that if they are found in wells, rivers, soil, or fish, it is the responsibility of the company to retrieve them and clean them up.
Okay, thank you.
I think that's a great idea.
Great idea.
Companies don't.
Well, what about these molecular markers in toxic chemicals, David? Is it going to work?
I found this idea one of the most poignant of the essay. This is the most clear call for internalizing externalities, and that is not to let companies shirk their responsibility for the costs that are foisted upon the common people, for the common good. Corporations have to take responsibility for the things they produce, the pollutions that they emit into the common sink of our natural resources, the air, the water, the soils. And corporations, whether it's chemically feasible to put molecular markers in these toxins, I have no idea, but it's an interesting idea.
And it comes right back and says, if this is your business, if this is how you're making money, you must also pay for the end usages as well. You must also pay for what happens if this causes pollution, death, and other problems to wildlife or humans.
And the practical outcome of this would be that for a corporation, it may become a liability rather than an asset to produce these toxins which persist in the biosphere.
Okay, thanks. Let's go on to our next comment then, and our next quote. Kisper, would you read this one for us as well? Vote, don't buy.
Democracy has been effectively eliminated in America by the influence of money. The fact remains that we live in plutocracy, government by the wealthy. One way out is to vote with your dollars, to withhold purchases from companies that act or respond inappropriately.
Okay, so he's going to say, hey, you need to vote with your dollars to withhold the purchases. And you mentioned this earlier, David. Tell us a little bit about this plutocracy and how maybe there are ways of working with these larger corporations to become more responsible.
Well, this connects to the earlier point that you brought up, and that is he calling for a change in actions by the citizenry? And the answer is clearly yes. Do we live in a plutocracy? Well, that is an empirical question. I would say yes. We like to think that we live in a government by the people, but the brute reality of our electoral system and our campaigning system is that wealth pays off in democracy. And Luke probably has much more to say about this than I do, but there is a lot of evidence that the more money you have, the greater vote and the greater political power you wield, and the consequence is big corporations have more political power than myself.
Okay, great. Any other comments on this? Luke, and
Real
then
quickly,
we'll wrap it up. Okay.
I agree, and I think that if I were going to do this list, I think everybody can pick some of the things here you may not agree with, but there are certain elements that you can agree with in all of this. And I think he does dismiss campaign finance reform too quickly, and I would have put that at the top of the list for the exact same reason that you have to have a thriving democracy in order for these sorts of things to work.
Okay, thanks. So you have about 30 seconds to give us a closing comment, David. What would you like us to remember from this piece?
I would like the class to remember that sustainability, like all interesting concepts, is multifaceted. And what we've seen here today is that on a biological level, sustainability can be thought of in terms of just ecosystems, that a deer population may overbreed and outstrip the carrying capacity of the land. What Hawken is bringing our attention to is that sustainability also has a social dimension, how human beings live in the biosphere, and what he's calling for is for our economics to be grounded in ecology, which heretofore it has not been.
Okay, thank you. We've really appreciated your helping us through this very interesting article, and appreciate the students as well. And we'll go ahead and move on into a discussion on Peter Singer in our next class period. Thanks, and thanks to all of you. Bye-bye.